Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts, Jaco van Zyl and Christine Sefein. Welcome everyone. I am happy and honored to have the pleasure of interviewing my partner in crime, Christine Sefein. Welcome, Christine.
Hi there. This is very exciting. I'm really glad to be doing this with you today. And I am honored to be interviewed by you, my co-host. I think we're going to have a good time.
It's lovely.
Yeah.
Christine is a licensed marriage and family therapist. Her professional specialization has been trauma and grief work. She has worked as a clinical director at a clinical grief center, as well as a clinical supervisor at California Lutheran University. She's also a former professor of the clinical psychology program at Antioch University. The theme of your chapter in our book, Cynical Therapies, Perspectives on the Anti-Therapeutic Nature of Critical Social Justice, is the miseducation of psychotherapists.
Yes.
It was a rather sobering but also tragic read to me, to be honest. The theme that emerged to me was a theme of returning to a place you felt very appreciative of, you had a fondness for, only to find that it has been corrupted. And to deal with that disillusionment was painful. All right, but before we develop that, how about we start right at the beginning?
Okay.
Your ethnic background. You're from a family of immigrants, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
So how about you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Egyptian. I'm also part Syrian, but my parents are born and raised there. So that's where they immigrated from in 1978. I wasn't born yet. I have an older sister, though, who lived in Egypt. So she has actually a really interesting perspective because she came here when she was about 6 years old as a child. So she has her early life memories, her very first early life memories are living in Egypt. That was technically her first language, and interestingly enough. So my parents immigrated here. They had come from a very politically and socially and culturally divided country. And at the time, I think they were just a part of a small percentage of Egyptians that were Coptic Orthodox, which is a form of Christianity, and not Muslim. And they were sort of completely overwhelmed and taken over, I would say, by a group of radical kind of Muslim terrorist types who, were bombing churches. My mom's childhood church actually was bombed and blown to smithereens. And it's one of the reasons she never went back to Egypt to visit, actually, when she came to the US, because it was too devastating to see what they had done. She went once and that was it for her. So yeah, they were escaping that. They were escaping, the lack of, potential opportunities if they were going to grow their family. My parents actually had a good amount of money and financial success there. They had, a full-time sort of, I guess, housekeepers, what you would call it here, who helped with my sister. My mom only really worked part-time just to kind of get out of the house. So they had a very nice life in that way, but they could see that the trajectory for their children wasn't going to be as good. It wasn't going to be as positive or full of opportunity. And that was the big motivator to say, well, I think we need to leave here and go to the US. And it was really my mother who was driving that effort and really saw that there'd be many more opportunities for us in the US, and that we wouldn't have to hide behind, our religion being Catholic, well, Christian, I should say. My sister and I grew up Catholic, but we Christian, it's all under that umbrella. But we wouldn't have to hide that if we were here in the States. They could practice being Coptic Orthodox, and they could practice, anything that they wanted to do. Whereas over there, if you are wearing a cross around your neck and you come across, some people and it's the wrong set of people, you might just find yourself beat up. You might find yourself dead, killed. I mean, you can't call the police there and have them come and respond to that. It's very corrupted,
Yeah.
and you can't sue anybody. You can't protest. All of this is extremely corrupted, and there's a lot of potential violence that's affiliated with those actions. So people just don't do that. They typically leave if that's what they want to do.
There was a dominant narrative back in the day.
Yes.
And there
Yes.
were clear camps
Yes.
of who was the enemy and who was friendly.
Yes. That's
Right.
right. And
And
so
that
you
actually
need to be,
prevented
yeah,
that
go
actually
ahead.
prevented the proper execution of duties by state departments
Yes.
and institutions,
Yes,
lest
that's right.
they be seen as colluding with the enemy.
That's right. And that's that was a huge challenge because they really claimed to be secular during that time, which means, separation of church and state, but that was not at all, that was a theory. It's not how they operated. How they operated was very much integrating those two parts. And so you're right, that there's this whole, what do we align with publicly? And, if we do take this action, what's that going to do with our alliances? I mean, there's a lot of complicated political reasoning behind why they choose to do or not do what they do or don't do. I mean, I think that's the case everywhere. It's not an issue of negligence. It's an issue of willful dismissal or willful ignorance, I should say, that could be
Justice couldn't
tarnished.
prevail in the situation.
No, it
Right,
was
right.
not going to, and it wouldn't today. It didn't back then. And you had more trouble if you were from there and were wearing your cross. If I had gone there as a tourist and put on my cross and they'd known I was Christian, it's not so inflammatory because at that point it's okay, you're a tourist, you're from some other place, so that's fine. We'll take your money and let you spend money here touring our beautiful country, and then you'll go home. So that's not as as threatening as being somebody who lives there and wanting to express themselves. Even the shows I watch that feature parts of Egypt today, pretty much everybody's a Muslim, even if they're a reform Muslim. There's some that are, so it's not the entire Muslim community. We're talking about the kind of this group of radical kind of thinkers, or the radical, bad actors, if you will.
Yeah.
But you do not see the Christian population growing either. So it's pretty much now almost snuffed out completely. I think there's 1 million or something left Coptic Orthodox Egyptians in the entire world. So they're very, very much kind of going out of the picture here. We're a dying breed. I mean, really, and it's only on my dad's side. My mom's side is a little bit different. So, but it's his side specifically that has such deep roots there.
So your family came to the US with your sister. You were born in the US.
Yes.
Initially, it was quite difficult for them
Yes.
to find their feet and to get rooted again in the United States.
Yes. It was,
but eventually they did.
Yes.
You grew up here. You received an education here.
Yes.
Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. So my parents, they didn't know the language. They used to go to English class at night school. And during the day, they were working any job, odd job they could find. When they gave up their belongings and moved here, just because they were doing well in the US or in Egypt does not mean that, the cost of living here is different. The amount, the money doesn't go as far, not even close. So when they came here and they had pretty much nothing, they needed to start over, which meant they needed to go back to college. They needed to get, get their degrees kind of updated in a sense, because they were both engineers, but their knowledge and what they studied was pretty much obsolete by the time they came here. It's not so much the case if that were today, but back then the US really had a monopoly on information and on education, all of that at higher education levels, at the university levels. So they needed to go back to school, and they also needed to learn English, and they were working. So my parents never didn't have more than 2 things going at one time. There was never a time where they just had a job and then they raised their kids. It was 2 jobs and the kids, two jobs and school, a job and school. There's always so much going on for them until I was about 16. So I didn't really spend a whole lot of time, with my parents on the off days or off hours. I was with my sister a lot because they just didn't have a lot of time off. So it was quite rough, but because of all of that, they learned the language, they learned how to read and write, they became full-fledged citizens, and they were able to move up the ladder enough to move us from where we started off, which was a pretty low income kind of poverty-ish, borderline poverty-ish community, into a middle class community where people were, professionals and were working and, had, a decent living. And that's around the time that I think my parents finally felt settled here. It took,
I
I
see.
think, around that long.
That community you grew up in, what kind of people did it consist of?
It was, interestingly, because there's such a narrative here in the
Mm,
States that, if you see a poor community or a person of color, you automatically assume that they came from a poor community or that they themselves, if you see a poor community, it must be full of people that are brown and black. That wasn't the case when I grew up. My experience was very different. It was poor white people mostly, some Latinos, but mostly it was poor white people, and it was very there's violence. I mean, you didn't want to
yeah.
walk out, the street by yourself. I mean, we played outside together as kids, but come nighttime or if you were alone, you didn't want to do that. You had kidnappings that were happening at that time in the 80s. It was the early 80s.
Oh, yes.
The whole picture where, the car would drive around slowly and try to call you over and kidnap you. That happened to me a couple of times. I mean, those aren't just, these kind of cliches of what it was like in the early 80s. They actually had that happening in my neighborhood where, oh, come here, little girl, give me some directions. So we had that going on. We had, our home was broken into multiple times. My sister and I would walk home from school, and we went to a Catholic school that was around the corner, but a lot of people there didn't really have a whole lot of money, but, or there were people that came from other communities that had money and just wanted their kids in Catholic school. So sort of a mixed bag, but most of them were not white. And, so I lived in a white community and I went to school in a community where they were mostly not white. And it was more attractive to be a Latina than it was to be a white girl with blonde hair. The white girl blonde hair was the message from the media. That's not the message I got from my daily life as a child. So those ideas were something that were not aligned necessarily with what I was experiencing at
Yeah.
school. So
Yeah.
it was a poor white community. The school itself, though, was, had a lot of Latinos as well. But like I said, I mean, for the most part, that was what was considered to be attractive. So, I was out of place, of course, there. I was out of place at high school too. But I didn't have the same experience of what constituted beauty back at that time. And I think that's kind of important because that's sort of part of this whole movement, is about that we've elevated white people to this level. And I did not experience an elevation of white people growing up, nor did I experience that. I mean, even in my early adulthood years. So that was not what I saw happening. And that's where the real kind of conflict is for me on this whole movement and where white people have been placed in juxtaposition to it. It's really not what I saw, nor was it what any of my friends witnessed or felt at the time.
Yeah.
So it feels completely manufactured to me.
The juxtaposition you're talking about, you're referring to the critical social justice narrative, the stereotype,
Correct. Yes.
the stereotype
Yes.
around certain identity markers. That
Yes.
there are certain privileged identity groups and less privileged identity groups,
Yes.
and that you need to go out into the world with that assumption that that is how the world is structured, and you treat every individual based on that
Yes.
stereotype.
You just nailed it. That's exactly
Mm.
right. So that narrative with what was reality, when you put those two things up next to each other, there is a huge disconnect in my experience, which is why I never really fully aligned with any part of this movement whatsoever. There was never
Right.
much to it that held any value to me personally because I could blow holes through it just from my own childhood, let
Right.
alone, other environments growing up, but especially those first early years for me, elementary school, grammar school, junior high.
After high school, you went and studied psychology.
I took a detour. So
Okay.
first I went to journalism school, and
Ah,
then
okay.
yes, I wanted to be a journalist and have a TV show. That was my dream. I back in the day, I don't feel this way today, but Oprah was my hero back in the day. I've since things have since changed and evolved, but when I was a small child, so that was sort of who I looked up to, I guess. But she was one of my heroes, if you will.
She
And
was many people's
she
hero.
was a Black woman as well. I did not, and so that was who, if you ask me who my favorite person was for many years as a child, that's who it was, a Black woman. And so
Yeah.
I went to journalism school at the time when I was first leaving, when I was first stepping into college. And I ended up working in entertainment, in public relations for the first 4 years of my career. So I was young. I was probably in my early 20s when I started working in entertainment. And then my mid 20s, I shifted and decided to go back to school. And that's when I went to school to become a psychotherapist. So
Mm.
about 25 years old is when I went back to get my graduate degree. My mother got sick during that time, and I sort of had this moment of wanting to be in the helping profession, or what I called what seemed to me to be the helping profession, which was psychology. So I decided to do that sort of as an awakening moment when my mother became ill, and that's what really inspired the change in career.
There was a there was a difficult but meaningful period of your life, right? The
Yes, it
period
was
when
both.
mom got ill
Yes,
while you were studying. Your
yes,
environment was very conducive to growth and self-development.
yes, it was. And that's, if we talk about sort of what you started off with, or what we started the show with earlier, returning there, there was so much healing, and there was an experience I had there where I just felt held, not just with my career, which was the first, most important part, but the second part of it was just personally. I had this ill mother. She died while I was in school and while I was in class, as a matter of fact. And the very first people who comforted me were my peers. They were my fellow students. They were the people in my class. It was my professor. I received a voicemail when I was in class, and I could not get any of my family on the phone, and they're the ones who sort of came rushing over to sort of, kind of hold me. And that was what my experience was with the school overall, is always feeling personally held, and that was a place where it was a haven for me. And I
Yeah,
was somewhat fractured, at many points during that time. And that school kind of helped be the container that allowed me to sort of put myself back together. So when I talk about returning there and seeing how it changed, I focused a lot on the professional component of that. But there's a
yeah.
personal component that I haven't spoken of until now. And that's the personal component for me, is the amount of um, the support that I received during a time when I was highly emotionally distraught. My mother's illness was
Mm,
a really painful
mm.
experience, and then her subsequent death, which was just a few years after that. So I was still in school when that happened. So those are the pieces that, when I think about that school and that time, that pop up as one of the safe places for me. And that's why I think I also had such an, really kind of jolting reaction when I went back to teach and saw the changes.
So how about we start comparing?
Yeah,
And before we do the actual comparing, let's lay the groundwork of what the environment was like in terms of the psychology subject as a subject, um, being a therapist, being trained as a therapist, the kind of lectures you had. How about we talk about that a bit?
sure. It was very classical in the structure and the model. Antioch has always had just a little bit, I think, of this idea of diversity that they try to kind of inject. The thing is, the idea of diversity at the time when I was first going to school there, and the idea of understanding other cultural components that add to one's, development of self, we'll say, or identity,
Mm.
they're very good ideas. It is important, that we're able to understand that not everybody we see is going to see the world through the same lens or have had the same
Yeah,
experience as us, right? So
absolutely.
they
Yeah.
took these good ideas that and they fostered that. The change, and I won't get into that, we'll get into that in a minute, but the change is when those ideas are hijacked and then
Uh-huh.
used to propel an agenda. Now, at the time,
Okay.
that is not what I experienced. At the time, those ideas were good. We were trying to understand how we responded to our environment. The first class you take is society and the individual, and it's about, your role in society and in your communities, and how you identify yourself. Your what communities do you consider to be a part of you, that you're a part of and that are part of you. That exploration was good and it was important, and it's that exploration that pushed me, that really encouraged
Yeah.
me to stay on the clinical
Yeah.
track of psychology. And my professor was one of the Little Rock Nine, who here in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the U.S., one of the first, or the first school to integrate Blacks and whites. So there were 9 Black students that were the first to integrate this particular white school back in whatever year it was, 60s or 70s, I cannot remember. One of the children that integrated the first, all white school was part of this group called the Little Rock Nine. It was 9 Black children, and one of them was my professor. He was incredible, and I owe him pretty much everything, because it was due to that class I decided to stay on a clinical track. And that's because, we were so diverse in there, and there was never a ranking of pain or a ranking of experience. There was never a narrative or a storyline. It was, you create the own story that you live. And yes, things outside of you influence that, but your own perception, there was a lot of, you have to take responsibility for how you create your own story and the people around you, and, why you do what you do. There was not this bigger, construct in society and the community that was controlling the story. That's the very big difference, is the personal responsibility. And he very much was focused on that, and on the healing, component of taking control of that and not letting outside stories influence how you saw yourself. And so that, to me, again, it was a good idea. And so it propelled me to stay on that track. That's not how it's being taught today, that very same
Yeah.
class.
Right.
Today, that very same class is about privilege and about critical social justice, all the ways in which you're privileged, all the ways in which you are not privileged. How have you oppressed people? How have you oppressed others? How have others oppressed you? And they make these huge collages now in that class as part of the curriculum, with just these pictures that are taken from, everywhere, magazines, all sorts of different places, to create this big privilege story and oppressor oppressed story. And that's the launch pad into the program now.
Yes.
That class is the launch pad. So when that class changed into this, that's become now it sets the precedent for how the rest of your program is going to go.
Yes.
That now is the fundamental component of it, is how critical social justice is now injected, or must be a part of the curriculum in every course going forward. Back then, that wasn't the case. It was one class, and that, idea of diversity. And then we moved into what classical psychology schools were doing, which is learning about different theories and different models, practicing, doing a lot of self-awareness work, a lot of internal work, a lot of understanding what it means to be in the room with a client, what it means to hold space, what it means to share space, parallel process that you go through while you're working with clients. It's all of these components, where the focus was so much on that. I mean, even for me as a student, I recently read my evaluations, and I had not opened them up for 20 years, if you can believe that. And I recently opened up a few and read them, and saw that, when I was being evaluated, one of the issues I struggled with at the time, and I carried into early part of my career, was the anxiety that I had sitting in silence. And my professor wrote a note about how well I had sort of had command of the theories and the models, but that I seemed to have so much anxiety in the silence. So the reason I bring that up is because that was the type of evaluating that was being done on us, so that we had to go back and say, okay, what's going on for me? He gave me that verbally too. It's not that I didn't hear it until this recent, but I read it on paper. That was a little different anyhow. But that was what the focus was. It wasn't on judging the students in social justice mindedness and whether they were adept in that arena. That's where we started to change the way we evaluated students. And so that wasn't the case when I was there. So that's, it was so key. It was so key though, for me to get that kind of feedback. And that mattered more in the end. And that was one of the key components that made it different, is just even how we were evaluating the students had changed.
And the trick is, when you sit with the individual, social aspects will come out anyway.
Yes.
Because you would have this curiosity, you would have, when we are trained in the client-centered approach, unconditional positive regard, that congruence, to sit curiously in psychoanalysis and say, without desire or memory,
Yes.
You want the person to develop in front of you, and you use what the person gives you. And if
Yes.
those things relate to the social and they're relevant, then they
Yes.
are relevant. But
Yes.
you do not go into the therapeutic space with these preset ideas. And that
That's
was
right.
precisely, I would imagine, what the early syllabus around plurality or multiculturalism
Yes.
perhaps wanted to achieve. It was,
Yes.
don't run into
That's
therapy with
exactly
these
right.
preconceived ideas, that ideas that were probably socially constructed, stereotypes,
Yes.
um, around certain types of people. Let the
Yes.
person tell you about who they are. And
Yes.
yet we find ourselves
That's right.
right at the opposite,
Yes.
the radical opposite
Yes.
from what they attempted to achieve back in the day, isn't it?
That's exactly right. It's exactly right. It's the total opposite of what they attempted to achieve. And the 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 ideas of going in there again, as a blank slate ish, and not having any kind of expectation. Of course, that is one of the key components of what we seek to do as therapists, and the kind of environment we want to provide, so that pretty much there's not any expectation on the client's end to
Mhm.
be or behave a certain way, or to share about something, or to speak about something. And that's, again, the good idea that was tainted later on, but that's where we started. And that was something that, in and of itself was already really challenging to do. I mean, for me, it was. And I think for a lot of people, it's counterintuitive to how we are in other settings outside of that. So it's not
Yes.
it doesn't just come natural most of the time. You sort of have to learn this. And maybe there's an essence about you that comes natural, but there's a way of behaving, or being, that I think is also needs to be learned. And so that was important, and those ideas paved. They were the groundwork. They were the reasons why we did this. We do this because we know people have these multicultural backgrounds, and we know that they have lots of components to who they are as people.
Right.
That's the entire purpose of having that sort of blankish, when you walk into the room, without expectation. So now we're coloring that and saying, no, you need to have an expectation. Not only do you need to
Oh,
have an expectation, like this is the opposite, you need to acknowledge it when you first walk into the room. In the state of California, our ethics board that regulates marriage and family therapists, the psychotherapists, it's the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. So I would say in my state of California specifically, my board, one of the, kind of guidelines that has been introduced is that, privilege is acknowledged in the room. They don't come out and say it that way. You have to kind of pull out your glossary of terms and look at terms and how the meanings have been changed and hijacked, because we know that's in our book here, Cynical Therapies. That's one of the most, I think, helpful parts of the book, is the glossary of terms in the front, because it helps you understand exactly what they mean when they use those words.
yes.
So those are all written in, all over the ethics board now, website, and expectation standards. So you need to acknowledge that. So not only are we not giving people the space to go in there without any expectation, we're actually starting the conversation by immediately entering that idea into the conversation and into the room before we've even made a relationship with our client. It's the thing that you say in the very beginning when you're first getting to know the person. And if they look different from you, or if they are, if they have a different gender than you, whatever it is, that's the immediate first thing you're going to say. So right away, that is already coloring and tainting the experience. And right away, that is, it's kind
Right.
of diminishing and erasing years and years, decades of
Of
of of,
progress.
of, of
Mhm.
progress.
So back in the day, the individual was primary.
Yes.
The social featured, and you address the social as it featured. Right
Yes.
now, the social is primary. And you
Yes.
go into the therapeutic space with those assumptions, with
Yes.
those stereotypes, and you
Yes.
impose that.
Yes.
That colors your therapy,
It
which is
does.
completely different. Not only that,
Yes.
but also the discourse change. We can say the same thing using two different discourses. The early discourse was the individual is respected as an individual. And like I said, you allow the individual to develop and self-discover, and you facilitate that.
Yes.
Where there is a plurality or multiculturalism, you respect that, and you see how the person incorporates their cultural perspectives into their lives. There is a welcoming, facilitating discourse when we
Yes.
look at multiculturalism that way. The discourse changed when it became a discourse of resentment and of envy. We can change we can teach exactly the same content, but if the discourse is one of entitlement and envy and resentment, we will be destroying.
That's just so brilliant how you put that. It's just
Yeah.
so brilliant. And that's exactly right. I mean, I couldn't have said it better, more concisely at the same time myself. That is such a brilliant way to put some understanding around this and what's happening. And this is exactly why
Yeah.
it's the field itself. It's so easy to corrupt the field, and the field is very easily influenced and easily corruptible.
Yes.
And so that's also something I think that was very easy to hijack and to take over. We are a captive audience in our field, and I think that's a huge part of that, especially because people tend to lump in psychology with sociology and social scientist work as well. All those things seem to kind of intersect. Even when we put together a clinical picture, we use a biopsychosocial assessment to do it. So we are looking at all of those components. So when that social component becomes so big, or those theories become so big and important, and they swallow up the individual, we're captive to that because it's part of how we work. We work in concert with some of these other theories, or we work in concert with some of these other disciplines within our own industry under the same umbrella, really. And so that is what is easy, I think, to taint and corrupt, because we're already captive to the influence of society on somebody, let alone to how
The plurality.
Yes, absolutely.
The plurality of theories would be fine. But if we encounter a theory where plurality would not be tolerated, a theory that would say this is the truth, and if you don't endorse the truth, you're complicit in genocide.
Yes.
Talk about concept creep.
It's horrifying concept.
Then,
yes.
then that theory would become primary. It would be exclusionary of any other competing theories, and that would become the only orthodox way of teaching things.
And that's that's the part that bothers me the most, is the fact that the exclusion of anything else, even if you wanted to leave that as a lens and a theory. Okay, I don't agree with it, and I don't align with it, but okay, it's one. It's not one anymore. It's the only
one.
Not one of many. It's not plurality, as you mentioned. It's not of a group of things or possibilities. It's one lens only. This is the part, when we talk about the whole idea of, what communism is like, and socialism, Marxism, all of the thing, people tend to say, well, don't overreact. No, the reason for that is because there's only one accepted set of ideas in a communist structure, right? There's one set of ideas that everybody must subscribe to, no variety of thought. Isn't that what sort of describes one of the core principles of critical social justice? And it also describes one of the core principles of communism. I mean, there's a lot of overlap in that. I mean, if you want to call it Marxist, that's fine too. But, for me, this one way of thinking and this one set of ideas, that you can't challenge it or you're going to suffer consequences. Whether you are, so you get socially ousted from your peer group, you get ousted from your work group, all the other, groups you're a part of. And then on top of being ousted, you're told that you're a bad person. So you're made to feel shameful, and you're made to feel that you're, you don't care about people. You in some way are part of the problem because of that. And you're complicit in creating all of these hardships for people that are outside of your control, that you have that have nothing to do with your current world whatsoever, let alone you don't even maybe know a single other person. They're strangers to you, but you're not even involved necessarily with their communities. And there's a blaming that you're taking on in all of that with the complicitness.
It's this the theory that allows for nothing else but the endorsement of
Yes.
the only theory.
The only one, the only
So
set of ideas.
there is after all no diversity. There is after all
There's
no
no diversity. And what are we threatened of, the most as human beings? One of the things we feel threatened by the most is abandonment, right? Or a rejection, fear of rejection and being abandoned. The entire kind of the foundational kind of the heartbeat of this movement is the threat. Okay, the threat of abandonment and the threat of rejection. That is the heartbeat of the movement. And I say that because if you don't have that component to pump through the ideas and you don't have the fear of that somehow showing up, whether it's overtly or covertly, that is where the control comes into play. The fear of not belonging, the fear of being abandoned, rejected, being othered in some way is extremely powerful on our psyches, because we're social beings. We want to be in relationship, right, with people. We want to be in connection with people. That fear is a driving factor that keeps this moving forward, in my opinion, because that is what we're afraid of the most, and that is what we are threatened with if we don't subscribe.
Social exclusion is the social equivalent to individual death.
Yes.
So
Oh,
it's
brilliant.
social death. So social death has an individual equivalent.
Yes.
And that is individual death.
That's
but
brilliant.
the experience is traumatic. We
Yes.
fear social exclusion
Yes.
and ousted from
Absolutely.
society. And that is the weapon critical social justice has.
Yes.
And that is why people self-censor, and that is why people are so reluctant to speak out.
Yes.
And it is interesting how it is actually a self-perpetuating monolithization that takes place. It's like almost as if this organism self-organizes now. The social organism self-organizes now to only look to the world through one lens, and that is this critical social justice lens.
Yes.
And like we said, out the window goes actual diversity and actual inclusion and actual tolerance.
Yes.
So not only did the discourse change from the university's side, you say something else here. You said, I found myself teaching on a program that facilitated bullying and censorship and promoted a narrow fundamentalist view of what it is to be a human being.
Oh, yes.
Instead of teaching students to be a healing presence, we were training them to deliver moral re-education to vulnerable clients. Yes. You continue saying, almost overnight, a training that delivered the knowledge, skills, and self-awareness required by a professional therapist pivoted into a training designed to produce social justice activists.
Yes. It was, I mean, it was almost, it felt overnight. And I think it was, it's the whole boiling the frog, theory that people talk about. That boiling started years prior, but it wasn't until it was over the cliff, until that pot boiled over, that all of a sudden it went from creep into capture, dominate, and snuff out dissidents, anything that's dissenting.
Perpetuate.
Yeah. And that was, I think, it was not expected. People ask me, well, when did you see that the shift? The shift was there. I went back to that school to teach in 2017. The shift was already there, and I did see it. But it's one thing to be an adjunct professor and to go in to teach a class or two, to go in and teach something specialized, which I was doing at that time. And that keeps enough distance from you in the program and you and the wider curriculum. When you do that, you have enough distance. It's not until you start to work or teach full time, which I did eventually, that you start to actually see all of the cracks, because you're no longer just going in as a specialist. Now you're going on in there as somebody who's part of the core faculty. Well, teaching faculty and core faculty overlap, but the idea here, and I was a full-time faculty member, is that you're part of the core group of people now that create curriculum guidelines and standards for all the other classes. You are overseeing that, and you're also part of kind of privileged conversations behind closed doors. That's when you start to really understand the depth of it. It's not just, it was when I got an office in the psychology department. I got my office when I became an affiliate instructor moving into full time. So I was now at that point kind of considered a staff member. I wasn't just an adjunct. And when I got my own office and walked up through the hallway, that's when I first saw all of the different posters and signs and communications from the
Yeah.
psych department and hearing the conversations with all the other professors in the hallway. It was much different. So it was very present. It's just I could turn away and look the other direction until I was full time and really immersed in it. That's when I couldn't look the other direction any longer.
Mm,
That's really what the
mm,
shift was for me. It was when I
I
changed
see.
my status, because back in 2017,
Mm,
they were having protests, to protest the election when Trump won, and the students were upset. And so the psychology department supported that. They supported having, gatherings. There's nothing wrong with protesting, but there's something wrong when the psychology department is promoting a protest, because that's the complete antithesis. I mean, it's the complete antithesis of what we're supposed to be, which is neutral, and which is not
right.
looking at a political one leaning or another, and not really having the vitriol and hate that was spewing from these students' mouths
Yeah.
about the
Mm,
political right started to fester
mm,
in the classroom. I could control it, and I didn't ask much about the protests because they bothered me. And they weren't going on when I started teaching any longer. They stopped. So it was just sort of hearing the stories when the students would talk as they're shuffling into the class for the night and then leaving. At that point I could stay away and distant.
I
It was a
see.
couple of years later where it would become very, very in clear view.
And isn't it also true then that not only was it this drive from the university sides to provide material and material within a discourse of critical social justice, but that subsequent generations of students that entered into the program had
Yes.
already been primed in a
Yes.
critical social justice, radicalized, intolerant way,
Yes.
almost as if they expected the program to teach these
Yes.
radical, intolerant theories.
Correct.
Almost so it's almost as if there was audience capture, almost as if
Yes.
what the audience required was also provided by the university, and that
Yes.
created this resonance chamber, this
It
echo
did.
chamber, right?
It did, because we were also the admissions team. So we
Mm.
controlled, we
Mm.
were the gatekeepers controlling the program. When I started, when I finally started there full time, and I was so excited to do that because, the thing is, I'm a master level therapist, I'm a master's level instructor. The fact that I could get a full-time teaching faculty position at a university and have that be guaranteed for me. I wasn't tenured. You don't really tenure that level of educator in this particular model, but it didn't matter. You pretty much, it would be impossible to be fired by that point. Quite frankly, it's impossible at that point. So to have that kind of opportunity, not every university was going to give that to me without a doctorate. That was something that was, so me choosing to speak out, me choosing to leave, it wasn't just about, oh gee, I'm leaving this work I love. It's also about knowing that that opportunity was once, maybe twice in a career, maybe, but probably once in a career, opportunity that I would ever have to be able to do it full time, and to still only have my master's degree. So I gave that
I
up
see.
too. It wasn't another, a lot of professorship jobs come around. There's a lot of schools that would contact me, and I had opportunities to be adjunct at 3 other universities at the same time. So it wasn't that, but it was to be a full-time faculty member at one place, and to have everything that came along with that. So for me to give that up, I mean, that was quite a lot of opportunity. I really had to say, I'm going to change and make a huge pivot. So it was a very complicated, it held a lot. It wasn't just quitting a job for me. It was a lot more than that. It was part of, just an identity. It was part of, and I understood though that if I didn't do that, I was part of the problem, because I was on the admissions team and I was part of admitting
Mm.
people into the school that were social justice warriors. I was part of that. And I did admit people in that said what we wanted to hear. That was the party line for the school about social justice. So I was complicit in that for, about 2 years that I was doing that. And so I was letting those people in. I had to make a case for why somebody of color or a black man, for example, a black woman didn't get accepted. I had to make that case why I didn't accept them after their admissions interview. I had to make a case for why I didn't. Whereas the white people, it was expected that they wouldn't get accepted. A portion of them wouldn't, and that would be
Yeah.
fine. And there was no reason. I didn't have to have a really solid reason. All I
Yeah.
had to say on there was, well, I don't think they were socially just, social justice minded enough. That's all I would have to say. And it's like, okay, great, no problem. But to turn away somebody of color, or to turn away somebody who had the right answer as a social justice warrior, you would have a lot to answer for. So we were actually creating the community single-handedly of next group of therapists, and the community there, right, was launching these people into their profession, their traineeships and their internships. And so we were actually fundamentally changing the population of professionals, and I was witnessing it and part of it, in real time. And I'm sitting here going, wow, what is it that I am creating here? And that was something that was probably the worst part of it, was needing to be the core team that fundamentally changed the student body makeup. We don't have enough Black people. We don't have enough men who are Black men. I mean, they don't like really men at all, quite frankly. I'll just be honest about that. But, so it was, we need to have a color scheme that looks like this, skin color. We need to have, sexual orientations that look like all of it, every part of you, so I had to, that was just, I just couldn't handle that any longer. That was another component. I didn't talk about that much, but it is something that was a huge part of it for me as well.
You said, critical social justice ideology allowed the activist students to make absolutist moral judgments regarding people's experience of pain and disenfranchisement. And you're talking about this after referring to a TED talk that you showed to your class.
Yes. Yeah. So I taught substance use courses too, because that's another area that I spent a good portion of my career in as well, especially because there's so much trauma around substance use. And I was a trauma specialist. So I worked in a lot of those environments. And so I was teaching, so I taught the courses, like intro courses, and I loved it. I actually loved teaching substance use. It was one of my favorite classes to teach. I brought in a TED talk. There was this new model of treating overdose in West Virginia. So West Virginia is a very poor state in the US. And there was a firefighter who was female, and she was a blonde woman. And she lived in West Virginia, and she was a firefighter, and she had, come to a lot of these 911 calls with people who were overdosing and whatnot. So she sort of took a step back, and I think she had a nursing degree too, or something like that. And anyhow, she took a step back and sort of evaluated and said, what can we do different so that we can rescue these people? And that it's not just about stopping the overdose, but about once they recover in the hospital, how do we get them to buy in to get into treatment? How do we get them to buy into that? And how can we facilitate it? So she came up with this model, which really was just about having multidisciplinary approach, and it ended up working very well. They ended up, I think, reducing like their overdose numbers by 60-something%, increasing people receiving treatment by like 30%. So the numbers were really staggering. It was phenomenal. So I brought it to the class, and their big problem is that she was white and blonde, and that she was working in a most predominantly white state. Yes, it's a predominantly white state, but it's also one of the poorest, if not the poorest. It's in the top 50. So those people don't have running water. I mean, if you look in the inner cities of California, so that's the LA areas, and then Northern California, San Francisco Bay Area, the counties around there, and the cities. So the inner cities, these highly populated areas, they have so many more resources available to help people who are underserved, or who don't have financial stability or whatever. They have so many services to provide. They can help you pay your electric bill. They'll help you get a computer for your child and wireless internet, anything that you want. These are places where they don't even have plumbing. They're still using a septic tank, and when it overflows, you better believe you're not going to school that day. You're going to fix the septic tank. You're not going to call a plumber. You're not going to call anybody, a professional, to come help you with it. You're going to be milking your cow. Okay. There's still farmers, okay, that milk their cows, and they need to eat, and they need to do what they need to do. I mean, and my sister lived there. She had students who would have to skip class for those reasons. So this is purely like, I want
real exposure to the elements.
Correct. And so she'd drive me around through all the different towns over there and show me the way that they were living, and the students' stories. And you'd see that. I mean, it's the typical. And so when they said that to me, I was so agitated, because they ought, well, but they're white. So no matter what, they're privileged. That is not
Ah,
the case. You're not a white privileged person in West Virginia who's living in the slums, which are worse than what you can even imagine in the inner cities in California, in LA, and all of these areas. So the comparison there, so, but it doesn't matter because, well, then the next argument was, yes, but where were they during the crack epidemic for the blacks in the 80s? Well, it's 2023 right now. We're not in the 80s. Okay, the crack epidemic in the 80s was that, we can talk for days on what happened there. That's not the point, because we need to move forward from where we are today. You can take the model and you can apply it differently and adapt it. That was what they were missing, is that you can adapt it. It is not going to be the perfect model in every community, but here's what you can do to adapt it differently. The idea, though,
yeah.
is there, the foundational principles. So that's where they took it. They took it into she's white, she's blonde, she only wants to save and rescue white people. And that was missing the entire boat. And it wasn't just one class. It was, I had several, I was teaching multiple sections of that class. So I had multiple cohorts, and it was in multiple cohorts that they were starting to do that. And it was very upsetting to me because, the dialogue changed into something political rather than focusing on what they were supposed to have learned from it. And I sat there and defended it, and I didn't like the way I felt, I had to be very defensive, I felt like, of everything. And I didn't like that feeling. I had so much anxiety that I just felt sick over starting the class. And that was something that was as much as I pushed them to think outside the box, as much as I was the one professor who would say the opposite of everybody else, that was great. And it helped and it worked to an extent. At the end of the day, though, it started to become too much for even me to take on. And I was somebody that faced challenges head on and put them in their place and said, if you can't get it together, you do not belong in this profession. This is not how we're going to do things here.
Such a corruption of the field.
Yes.
It's the helping profession.
Yes.
It's a helping profession, and yet we find people who consider certain populations ineligible for suffering
Yes.
relief
They're
purely
ineligible. Correct. And those
based on the color of their skin.
purely
How?
based based on who they voted for. I have to say that because that started to trump everything else. What started to trump everything was who did they vote for in the election? I can't work with a Trump supporter. This is regular dialogue and discourse in class. It was regular, meaning every quarter I would hear about this. That it stopped being, well, it would be challenging to work with, domestic violence perpetrator, or it would be challenging to work with a sex crimes offender. That's typically what you hear them say when you ask what would be a challenging population. And that's typical. Child abuse are typical. Okay, we get that and we understand why. But when they started to say Trump supporter, and that trumped, pun intended, I guess, no pun intended, it trumped everything else, that's when I knew we were in real trouble, because that was now outside of what we would deem to be, very abusive, awful behavior. And how do you have empathy for somebody who did that? That's understandable. When you're talking about predators,
right?
That's understandable. This is now, I don't have empathy for somebody who didn't hurt anybody else, didn't commit a crime, just simply had a different choice in politics
Or a political belief.
In political beliefs, because they affiliate now everything that's wrong in the world with one group. So that was way worse to me, way more problematic than saying I can't work with, somebody who's Black, even, because that right there is a bigger chunk of the population. We're talking about 50% at least.
But I think, and this is to the benefit of our listeners, I think it is necessary to hear how dehumanizing this ideology is.
Yes.
How it has the potential to turn otherwise decent people into very intolerant, even dehumanizing individuals. That they were dissatisfied with the progress that lady made in reducing addiction and addressing the trauma underlying that addiction. It's something that should be celebrated, something that should be replicated.
Yes.
But we have a problem with that because the people who benefited from it were ineligible to have their suffering reduced based on their skin color.
Yes.
It is dehumanizing. It is.
Yes.
And
that's exactly
and
right.
that is what is so problematic about about this ideology.
Yes,
It's
because pain is
horrible.
ranked. It is ranked. And with a
Mm,
ranking, that ranking will tell you how much you deserve to have a sense of healing or relief from your suffering. And it's ranked based on all these multiple points, right? The idea of intersectionality. What is that? It's all the ways in which you're marginalized. So, okay, I'm a woman, so I'm marginalized. I have brown skin, so I'm marginalized. I grew up wherever, so I'm marginalized. All of those data points. So within being marginalized, there's still a pecking order. There's still a
yeah.
ranking system going on.
And that is assumed
Um,
to be true. It is imposed
that
on
is
the
assumed to be
individual.
true,
It
correct?
is not
I don't see
explored
myself that way.
and discovered. No, it's not explored and discovered. It
No,
is assumed to be
no,
true
it
and
is
imposed upon the
correct.
individual.
Correct. And the therapist is affirming it, right? I mean, one of the biggest things we would tell parents, if you're struggling to find a therapist, you need to find therapists who are exploratory in nature rather than affirmative in nature. Okay. Because
Yeah.
the therapists are affirming all of this. They're affirming the narrative, they're affirming the story. Where does that come from? It comes from how they're training, how they're getting trained. So it's coming from the training programs. That's the
Yes.
problem here that is so pervasive, because those programs have to fundamentally change the core of their curriculum in order for this to improve and to become, less of a problem here, at least in the States. That's not happening. They're doubling down and they're tripling down on this type of curriculum. So no matter what you do, you're the crop of people that you're teaching to be the next, to take over, to be the legacy, hand that and pass that along, are captured in programs that are extremely radical. And if you don't change that, then there's no other opportunity, there's no other community in which they're ever going to be able to kind of let that go. I don't see how that happens. I don't see how that happens if the schools don't change. I don't see a world in which
Right.
we recover from this
Mm.
if the schooling programs do not let some of this go. I don't see a world in which this is going to be different, because it only, for you to kind of get yourself out of the captive mindset. Yes, you can get through school, and then once you're licensed, do your own thing and not be captivated by that. But that's not typically what happens. What typically happens is you become changed, and it infiltrates the way you think. You become changed in how you practice
Yeah.
because of the influence of all of this curriculum, and how you're being guided to ask questions, and how you're being guided to use interventions in the room. All of that is
Yeah.
being guided and shaded and colored in by all of these social justice warrior people who are now fundamentally changing what's happening at the curriculum level at the school. So without the schools changing, I don't see where there's a lot of hope. That's where I've really struggled, where people have said, well, there's hope in certain ways. I see that there can be. I agree. But if you don't get the schools, and you cannot shift the schools viewpoint, how are we going to shift the entire profession?
And it won't clear up by itself.
No,
No.
no, it won't. It's not going to self-select, to where eventually, just fizzles out. I mean, this is capture and the steam. The textbooks change. So the textbooks you read are like, yeah, family therapy theory, but now we add a chapter that is, how do you apply it using critical social justice? How do you apply it using a diversity lens? So they take all of that stuff, and they're still giving credit to those people who wrote the original theories and models, but now they're saying, let's modernize it. So they add a chapter, right? So, and they add this. So so now the textbooks have changed. So what do you do now? You take that out and go back to how it was? That would be what we don't consider progress as going back to something we did before. We consider progress as something new and evolved, right?
Adding something new.
So how do you replace that? What do you do so that you're progressing, and evolving, and you're going away from critical social justice and back to your roots? It still requires you to go backwards.
Christine, and isn't it interesting that when we attend some of these classes, or when we listen to some of these students speak, they talk about oppressive regimes. They
Yes.
talk about regimes such as the Third Reich, and they talk as if they were part of the courageous few who stood up against this oppressive regime of Nazism. And not only the students talking about it, but also some of these lecturers talking about that, right?
Yes.
Where is their courage now?
Yes. Where is it?
You said here, therapist trainers must model the qualities that we want our students to exhibit. One of these qualities would be courage. It is time to stand up and tell the truth about what is happening to our profession. Our students and their future clients require this level of commitment and bravery.
Yes. It is crucial because that is the only way that you change the schools. It's the only way that you can actually go back to where it all starts and where it begins. And we all know that critical social justice started in academia. All of this, and it wasn't psychology necessarily, but it started in academia. So we know that that is the launch pad for a lot of very bad ideas. So how
Yeah.
do you go back? And that's where, when we can do that and we can start to shift the way we teach, even just 10%, okay, I'll take 10%, then I think that opens the window for us moving into a better direction. But without the courage and people standing up, without professors saying, no, I'm not going to teach that, without people saying, no, I'm not going to teach that curriculum, then that doesn't happen. If you have enough of them that do it, they don't have to make a big stink and they don't have to make a really big scene. They can simply say no. And if that's respected and enough of them do that, it will slowly die off on its own. It'll slowly stop being as powerful. There's still going to be those people, I think, who are always going to kind of march to the beat of that drummer now that it's the cat's out of the bag, that the genie's out of the bottle, as they say.
Right.
And that's okay. I mean, it is what it is. But there is an opportunity to not increase or widen that scope, to actually let that scope narrow itself down, even if
To
it's
rein
still
it
there.
in.
Rein it in, keep it quiet, focus, narrowed, okay, so that it doesn't overtake the entire,
Dominate.
and dominate the entire program. And if we can get enough professors who just make those adjustments and say no and leave this out of it, then I think there's a lot of hope for the schools. But that's who they have to stand up and they have to say, we're not going to do it. Forget the administrators. The administrators are bought and sold, and grant money, all of that is connected to curriculum, and it's connected to the administrators who are hiring the faculty. That I'm not even going to get into the administrator level. I'm talking about what professors can do in their own classrooms on a micro level that can make a macro change over time.
Christine, thank you.
Thank you.
I am privileged to have to know you. So I'm privileged to be on this journey with you. I really enjoyed your chapter.
Thank you so much.
And I'm looking forward to our adventure together.
I know. Adventure it has been indeed, and it continues, and it is morphing and developing and changing. And I couldn't have asked for a better co-host and interviewer. And I am truly honored as well. I've told you so many times what a privilege and honor it is to work with you as well. So
absolutely.
I'm learning a lot. We are exploring indeed.
Thank you.